Since the beginning of March, we have been bugged by an early spring snafu, and it won't be long now before we get bugged by the bugs themselves, and that includes ticks. Can a colder than average winter or a spring setback tamp the effect of tick season, or is there even a season at all? For the answer to that, meteorology meets entomology in this week's Earthbeat. Recently, during one of our anomalous midwinter warm spells, I ventured out into Rothrock State Forest. It was in the 60s, the sun was out, and the sunlight bouncing off the recently fallen snow created a pleasant and picturesque afternoon to go wandering in the woods. After a hike, I usually expect some bugs or perhaps a spider to be crawling on my clothing, but on this particular day I discovered one of the last things I was expecting to find on a February day: a tick.
Having said that, as soon as it warms up, they come out and they come hunting for you. And it doesn't matter what time of year, they don't really care. They'll just come up when it's warm.
Dr. Joyce Sakamoto is a research associate in Penn State's Department of Entomology, whose research focuses on ticks. I sat down and spoke with her to get some insight into the behavior of these eight-legged arachnids. The first big question, is there really such a thing as a tick season?
No, they'll come back up. So I have gone out in January, I've gone out in February, and we have found ticks. So in February we had that warm spell and we collected almost 300 ticks, almost 300 ticks.
300,
yeah.
Wow.
Yep, and that was in about an hour.
Now ideally, Dr. Sakamoto and her lab do not hope to collect their tick samples by getting some on themselves or their clothing. So how do they do it?
So we use what's called a flag. So we have, it's a big stick, a dowel stick, that has a cloth on it that's about a yard long. And it's white, so we can see the contrast. We need it to be white so that we can see the ticks on them. So if you're using a drag, instead of just one leg or one arm or whatever happens to be nearby, you're increasing the surface area of contact.
Ticks cannot fly or jump. They need to use their two front legs to quest for a host. After sensing that a host, such as an animal or person, is nearby, they reach out their legs to attach to the fur or clothing of whatever happens to be passing by. There is a common belief that a harsh winter can wipe out a big percentage of the tick population and yield less of them the following summer. But this is not necessarily the case. The transition from fall to winter is more of a gradual slide, and therefore the ticks can adapt.
So ticks, if you take them off yourself and you put them into a plastic bag, throw them in the freezer, they'll be dead. I don't kill them. They have no way of being able to escape. They have no way of protecting themselves. But naturally, they will find a way to get away if they can. They'll usually burrow into the soil, or if not in the soil, then the leaf litter that's above, which is fairly insulating. And then also if you have snow on top of that, they're definitely insulated a lot more.
As it turns out, the only way that the cold can have a big influence on ticks is if they take up residence somewhere that has a lot of water. In a cold winter, that water will freeze, and in turn freeze the ticks. Otherwise, the cold does not directly have a major influence on them. However, another aspect of the weather does.
Humidity has much more serious impact, or lack of humidity, on ticks. When they're questing, they're being exposed to the environment. They're waiting and waiting and waiting for something to come by. If they don't find anything, then they have to go back down and rehydrate. And they can rehydrate because they produce this saliva that can absorb water from the air. It's what's called hygroscopic saliva. But they do this by going into the leaf litter and absorbing the water that's like in the air immediately surrounding them.
The more frequently that ticks need to crawl up and down, switching between searching for water and searching for a host, the more energy they expend. And in the older adult ticks, sometimes it gets to be too much. So overly dry years or dry weather patterns can take a much greater toll.
So that would have much more of an impact on them than, say, like whether or not it gets cold.
So given that we could potentially interact with ticks at any point in the year, as long as it is mild enough, are there certain hotspots for ticks that we could try to avoid?
There are pockets where it can be pretty bad, and it's it's unfortunate that those pockets also happen to be areas where people really want to go. Areas where you have a lot of traffic, and that's not just human traffic, it's mostly animal traffic, those tend to be areas that are much more likely to have ticks in them. So I find that areas where there's a lot of water, or areas that are what's called an ecotone, so you have an area where you may have a grassy pasture right next to a budding, like a protective cover, so like tree line. Those tend to have high numbers of ticks in those areas, and those also tend to be right where bike paths and hiking paths tend to go.
Humans are not the primary target of ticks. They, more often than not, just end up being the unfortunate bystanders. Nevertheless, before you go out, you can take some preventative measures by eliminating as much bare skin as possible, wearing long-sleeve shirts and long pants, and by using an insect repellent with DEET. Upon coming home, check yourself thoroughly. Remember to shower immediately, and instead of throwing your clothes directly into the washer, where ticks can survive and may even enjoy the water, throw them into the dryer. Keep these tips in mind the next time you venture outdoors during any month of the year. For Weather World, I'm Ben Reppert.